It's not about, it's not about, it's not about the injury. It's not about, it's not about, it's not about the injury. It's about the recovery. It's about the recovery.
Welcome, welcome, welcome to another edition of Paul Padda for the People. I'm your host, Michael Humphreys, and once again, thank you for joining us on the special edition of Paul Padda for the People from Red Chimp Studios. You know, folks, we've created these podcasts as a means of communicating to the citizens and residents of the Las Vegas Valley matters of public interest and public importance. And also, we would like to identify those people who are making the Valley a better place, striving to make the Valley a better place for all of us who live and work here. And so it is with that in mind that I'm happy to have our guest here today, Judge Joe Hardy. Judge Hardy is a sitting judge on the Clark County District Court, I believe, Department number 15?
15, yes.
And he is more or less hot off the presses. You just came from a case today that you've been sitting on. Did the case reach conclusion, fruition?
It did, just returned with a verdict just before it came over here.
Okay. Okay, so you're here to talk about sentencing. So let's talk a little bit about sentencing within the context of a criminal case. Now let's assume that the jury has found the defendant guilty. The case is not over by any means because the defendant then has to be defended. Let me ask you this basic question. Since the jury made the finding of guilt as to the defendant, do they get to decide what the punishment is, what the penalty is?
No, the judge does that in the sentencing process.
And so you, as the judge, have a role that's different from the jury. And again, I would assume that's because of the impartiality of it all.
Right.
Some jurors may be so aggrieved by what the defendant did that they really want to hammer him or her, as the case may be. Now, what are the various components of sentencing? Is it just, I mean, people typically think about you're going to jail, but there are other aspects that you can impose on a sentence, is there not?
Yeah, there are. So you have potential of probation, for example.
Right.
Which means that instead of going to prison, the defendant is on probation, typically living at home, checking in, depending on, you have varying levels of probation.
Right.
So they can check in weekly, monthly, they can be monitored. So you have that. You have a range of, time, and that would apply even with probation, or if they're going to prison, 2 to 5 years or
We'll talk about the time in a minute, but is there also the capacity for you to impose fines?
Yes.
And what about supervised release after the defendant gets out of jail?
Yeah, so the post-jail, so the parole is what we have in state court. We as judges are not really involved in the parole.
You're not involved in that?
Yeah.
What about forfeiture? Can you impose?
We do, yes. So a lot of times, if somebody's pleaded guilty without going to trial, the sides will agree that the defendant, if it's, let's say, a robbery, he stole $1,000, well, part of the agreement will typically be that the defendant's, on the hook, if you will, to repay that $1,000.
To make the victim whole.
Right.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty, going back to the penal penalty. What sets the range of a jail sentence? I mean, if somebody committed murder, you're not going to give them 20 days, and if somebody commits jaywalking, you're not going to give them 20 years.
Right.
So what are the parameters? What are the boundaries? And how are those boundaries set? Who sets the boundaries?
Sure.
Is it the legislature?
It
is in the statute?
Exactly. It's the legislature by statute sets the boundaries in terms of a minimum time as well as a maximum time, and then we as judges have discretion within those boundaries, if you will. So if it's between 2 to 5 years, you can sentence, 19 months to 48 months, for example. So as long as you're within those boundaries as a judge, that's your discretion.
So basically what you're saying is you can do whatever you want to do within those boundaries, right?
Well, there is a lot of law that basically says exactly what you just did. As long as you're within the boundaries, the judge, it's up to the judge.
So let's parse that a little bit
Sure.
more. Within those boundaries of, let's say it's 0 to 5 years and you pick the offense, what are the dynamics or deliberations you go through to arrive at what is a fair sentence? Do you compare it to other sentences
Sure.
that have been imposed in that court or that sort of thing?
Yeah, so you have a report that's prepared that goes through the defendant's background, criminal history, the facts of the case.
And let me just stop you
Sure.
there. I hate to interrupt. That is called a pre-sentence report, right?
Yes.
And who prepares the pre-sentence report, and why is it important who prepares that report?
Yeah, so the Department of Parole and Probation prepares that.
And they do not have a dog in the fight,
Right,
do they?
exactly.
I mean, they're not the defendant, they're not the prosecutor. Presumably, they are being objective even though they don't wear a black robe, right?
Right, it's basically, yeah, that's a good point. It's a presentation of facts, the multitude of facts, and they get very in-depth, but their job is to give us as the judges the facts, and then we as the judges take those and apply, like you said, maybe what we've seen in other cases, what the facts of that particular case are, the background. So say, for example, somebody comes in and has, 7 prior felonies. Well, I'm going to take that into consideration versus somebody who, this is their first offense. Let's take that into account, and, the person with 7 very likely is not going to get probation, for example.
Right.
Versus a person who this is their first time offense. Well, let's give them probation and a chance to, be a productive member of society and see how they do. Now, to assuage some concerns, if somebody's given probation, they have rules that they need to follow. And the Department of Parole and Probation, again, keeps track of them. And so if the person is found to violate the rules, then the Department of Parole and Probation can file what's called a violation report. And
Right.
that comes in front of us as judges, and we can then determine whether to revoke probation, put the person in prison,
Understood.
or keep them on probation. Sentencings are very difficult because you have to consider, the victim, the defendant, the background, our community as a whole.
Right.
And you have this large range, so your discretion very much comes into play. And there have been, so typically I'll decide, okay, here's what I'm planning on doing when I go in. But sometimes, the victim will say something, or the defense attorney or the state even. I had one where I just, in this campaigning process, you go out and meet all these people. I met a victim that apparently I sentenced somebody who really hurt her, and she was very grateful for what I did. And she spoke, and I'm sure that affected how I ended up sentencing.
You just talked about your campaign. In the few seconds that we have left, I would like for you to tell our viewers and the people of Las Vegas why you like being a judge and why you would like to be a judge for another term.
Sure. So being a judge is my dream job. I absolutely love it. I love serving the public, giving back to the community. You know, like I said, I'm a third generation Nevadan, grew up here. And my parents always taught me, you know, give back to the community that you grew up in. And so I am honored and privileged to do that and hope to be able to continue to do that hereafter.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Final question.
Sure.
I always like to ask a fun question, and it's always the same question. Suppose you have a relative that calls you up from out of state and says, hey, I've got a friend coming into town. He or she's only going to be here for a day or two, a day and a half. They're on business, what have you. What is the one thing in Las Vegas that you would recommend that I tell my friend that they can't miss in Las Vegas?
Oh,
it could
man.
be something in the Strip. It could be a restaurant.
Sure.
It could be a natural phenomena such as
Yeah.
Red Rock. What is it that you would tell your relative to tell his or her friend, you can't miss this if you come to Las Vegas?
So I'll go back to my roots in Boulder City.
Okay.
Hoover Dam.
There you go. Hoover Dam.
Spectacular.
Yeah. I believe, is it one of the wonders of the world? I'm not.
One of the modern wonders, maybe.
Okay. Anyway, it's a great place for you to go.
Yeah.
And that is a great time for us to end this interview.
Okay.
I'm going to, given the signs of the time, I'm touching elbows with you. Thank you, Judge Joe Hardy,
Thank
for
you.
being with us for Paul Padda for the People. Good luck to you in your campaign and in your race for Judge of the Clark County District Court Judge. And thank all of you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again at Paul Padda for the People podcast. Take care. Goodbye.
It's not about, it's not about, it's not about the